What do you think about this gag order? Is the judge going to grant it? And assuming he does, should we assume Trump will appeal it?
I do think that it's going to be granted, at least in some form to some degree. And I think one of the reasons why that is so good news, or such good news rather, is because for everyone, for the trial, for the justice system as a whole.
There you go.
Because what we know of Donald Trump, he has already shown us to be true, meaning that he's given us the playbook. We've seen with Judge Engoron, we've seen when it came to E. Jean Carroll, what he will do with Judge Chuckton, what he will do. There's precedent given what Judge Chuckton has already done in D.C., and there is a basis for Alvin Bragg making this ask, particularly because he asked about not only court employees, not only the judges, but particularly the jurors. And that's one of the things that people don't know. In New York State, a defendant has the right to know the identity of their jurors by name. And so what they are asking for is a very narrowly tailored gag order that I do believe is going to be granted, because ultimately this judge has to prevent this trial from becoming a circus. And we've already seen it. The track record is already there. So Alvin Bragg was able to use everything that Donald Trump has already done to put in this request. And I do think we're going to see most of it, if not all of it, granted.
Luke, Charles just said it. We have seen the circus. The last time Donald Trump was in a courtroom, the judge had to scold him because he couldn't control himself. This next trial, Trump has no choice. He has to show up. What do you think? How do you think this whole thing's going to go?
Yeah, I mean, look, Donald Trump being in court is never a good thing for his attorneys. He does make outbursts. Several times judges have had to tell him specifically that he cannot act the way that he acts in public. He is known to threaten jurors to put messages out on social media that are negative about judges, clerks. He's known to whip up a frenzy against people in the courtroom. And so, yes, I would expect there to be chaos if Donald Trump is in court, and I would expect him to run afoul of judicial orders. And I have long said that I believe Donald Trump gets a lot of leeway in court, more than a normal defendant. I used to cover courts, and if anybody did the types of things that he does from the bench many times, or says the things he says on social media, they would often find themselves in contempt of court. But to date, Donald Trump has been allowed to get away with some of these antics, and we'll see if he's still allowed to do that as these trial dates approach.
Charles, it has seemed like one of Trump's greatest assets or allies is the appeals process. It is now just getting underway. Can you explain how it works in New York?
Well, this is going to be a lot different when you're talking about the appeals of these judgments versus the appeals that he's making in criminal court. And one of the reasons why is because the case is over. We are mid-case when you're talking about Judge Chuckton and the immunity argument and the 14th Amendment. All of those things are ongoing. This is a judgment which has already been entered both by Judge Engoron with respect to the state AG's office, as well as E. Jean Carroll. So he has to come up with that money.
This is what I want to talk about, right? He has to come up with this money in a month. How is that going to work, right? We've heard these sound bites of Tish James saying she's eyeing 40 Wall Street. What does that mean? A month from now, if he doesn't show up with $500 million, she can't seize the building.
No, she can't. But what she can try to do is move to collect vis-a-vis a lien. What she's going to start to do, or what Donald Trump is going to start to do, is he's going to basically go to the clerk and say, I need more time to pay. That by itself is not an excuse for you to get the time that you've asked for. You have to have some level of a reasonable showing as to what you are doing to try and get that money. Without that, Letitia James and her office can go as a creditor and say, this judgment was entered, this money is owed, I want to put a lien on these assets, and she can effectively do that. So it really will be up to the judge once he makes the appeal to the clerk, which he will, as to how much time he's going to get before the judge actually begins to try to enforce whatever liens or collective actions Letitia James wants to take.
Is there any scenario where Donald Trump wouldn't have to pay this money, right? Let's say he gets all of these delays and now it's next spring. Let's say for some reason Donald Trump wins the presidential election. Can he get this wiped?
You know, Stephanie, the beauty about this is that this is in civil court in New York State.
The beauty for New York State.
The beauty for New York State. Certainly not for Donald Trump or his defense team. He cannot do anything about this, even if he is sitting at the Resolute desk at 1600, because number one, it's a civil matter. Number two, it's already concluded. The judgments are already entered. And number three, it's a state matter. So it's not like with Judge Chuckton or Judge Cannon that he could basically say, look, I'm going to appoint a new AG who's going to dismiss this all. Because these are state matters and a civil matter, he is going to have to figure out a way to pay this money.
Shannon, let's talk immigration. As the New York Times is putting it, President Biden is putting a lot more focus on it. What's the plan from the White House now?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, there's this visit to the border, and certainly polling indicates that this has become a major issue for voters. Among the Republican base and certainly among Republican voters, immigration has always been a top issue. But we have seen, I'd say, over the course of the past year in polls, and our reporting indicates this as well, that even among Democrat and independent voters, immigration has really increased in a priority for voters. And I think that is largely certainly because of the impact people have been seeing in their own lives when you are seeing large groups of immigrants who are arriving in cities like New York City and Chicago and Denver, and that's becoming noticeable in some of these communities. So it's on the White House's radar. There's certainly talk, my colleagues have reported, about some swift action, something the president can do to show he is taking some action here. Because as you noted at the beginning, Steph, you look at those poll numbers and such a wide margin between President Biden and President Trump on who voters think is best to handle immigration.
But Luke, the president can only do so much. Real immigration reform has to come from Congress. And Donald Trump is making sure that doesn't happen. We all know this. He had his allies kill that recent border bill. But here's what's crazy. That Monmouth poll that we just talked about found that only a third of Americans blame Republicans for that bill not getting a vote. Half of them are blaming both parties equally. That is the belief of all of those voters, and it's just not true. It was Republicans that single-handedly tanked this thing.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. I mean, but what you're seeing in that poll is Mitch McConnell's great lesson of politics, which he's often said, is that when one party gums things up in Congress and defeats things, which is what McConnell did to Barack Obama, the president often gets blamed, or both parties get blamed, or Washington in general gets blamed. And so Republicans have had a strategy, not just under McConnell, but House Republicans, that they know sometimes when they kill something or defeat a Democratic priority, a reform bill, that they often don't end up actually getting the blame, no matter how many times those of us in the news media write exactly who is to blame or who killed something. The public has lower information voters will often just blame Washington generally, or blame the president often for the state of things, and not actually dig into the details about who is responsible.
All right, well, Luke, tell us about the looming government shutdown. What's the mood on the Hill right now?
I would say not good. If I had to bet, I think we're headed for a shutdown. As you know, the House took a 2-week vacation in the middle of negotiations, and they don't come back even until Wednesday night. That leaves almost no time to pass spending bills. As you know, it takes a while to get legislation through Congress, and we have 4 individual spending bills that still need to pass. So even if a deal were reached tonight or tomorrow at this meeting with President Biden, it would still logistically be very difficult to keep the government open ahead of the deadline. I really don't see any way to avoid at least a short government shutdown at this point. But tomorrow, President Biden will have that big meeting at the White House, and we'll see if he can't put some pressure on Congress and the Republicans in Congress to get a deal.